Huh? Yeah, let's do it. It's pretty late. Okay. Okay, double tight. Take your seats. Take your cholent. Erev Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Parashat Vayeshev. Erev Chanukah. Couple of days. It's a big holiday, Chaim. It's major stuff.
Shabbat is most important than most holidays. Am I right, Rabbi?
We're about to see a difference.
Shabbat has a kedusha of all holidays.
Rabbi, I want to share a tremendous hidush.
You're going to be live, okay?
Okay.
We're advancing. Rubinoff. That's why you do it, you know?
There's a Gemara on Shabbat on Daf Chav Aleph. Chaim, get this Gemara good because it's important. I'll read you the sentence inside. Try to understand it. It's not hard. The Gemara says in the name of Rav, Amar Rav, Pitilot u'shmanim she'anu chachamim she'en madlikim behem b'Shabbat. There are certain oils and certain candles in wicks that the rabbis don't want you to use on Shabbat. Why not?
That's a Mishnah.
Yeah, part of the Mishnah.
I did that.
Why don't they want you to use it on Shabbat? Because it could be that these oils or these wicks, they are inferior. They're not the best of quality. So we're afraid that when the guy lights it on Shabbat, the candle itself, it might flicker. It might sputter or maybe go out of control. So therefore on Shabbat, if a guy uses one of these candles on Shabbat, all of a sudden he realizes that something's going wrong with his nehot, with his candles, he might come to adjust it. And if you adjust the candle on Shabbat, Michal Shabbat. Therefore the rabbis tell us there's certain pitilot and shmarim, certain wicks and certain oils that you're not allowed to use on Shabbat. However, the Gemara continues and says, those oils and wicks that the rabbis don't want you to use on Shabbat, however, madliki behem b'Chanukah. But on Chanukah, these inferior lights that they don't want you to use on Shabbat, on Chanukah it's permissible. Why? Because on Chanukah, it doesn't make a difference if the oil draws well or if it's a strong flame. Bottom line is that they're not so makpid, the rabbis are not so careful in the type of oil that you use. Yes, indeed, it's obviously more proper to use, as we all know, shemen zayit, but it's not ma'akev. It's not, it doesn't destroy the mitzvah. So therefore, whatever oil and candles and wicks the rabbis don't want you to use on Shabbat, lest you come to be mehalel, on Chanukah it's permissible. I'll read you the sentence one more time to get it good. Amarav, pitilot u'shmanim, which are wicks and oil. She'anu hachamim she'ein madlikim behem b'Shabbat. The rabbis tell us don't use it on Shabbat. However, madlikim behem b'Chanukah. On Chanukah, you're allowed to use it. That's the statement inside the Gemara. There's a fascinating Sfat Emet. Sfat Emet, he turns his Gemara on its head. And he says that I'm able to use his Gemara to tell me an amazing musar. And he starts off with an introduction. And he says, this Gemara is really referring to the essence of every human being. And obviously the essence of every human being is his soul, his neshama. And the soul that we have in every single person is obviously a part of God. When the Torah tells us that God blew life into Adam Rishon, how does the Torah use, which language does it use? It says v'apach be'apav, that he blew inside of him. And when a person blows from himself into something else, he blows a piece of himself. If I'm blowing up a balloon, inside the balloon it's a piece of me. It's some of my air that's inside the balloon. So therefore, anytime that when God blew life into Adam, into the first man, he blew a piece of himself into Adam. And that's why it says that the neshama is what's called chelek elokai mima'al. It really belongs to God. So the neshama is a piece of us. Not only that, but the rabbis tell us that the neshama, throughout rabbinic literature, it's always referred to as a candle. King Solomon says, Ner Hashem nishmat Adam. that the candle of God is the neshama. That's why sometimes, Rabbi, you have it a lot, that you see that the soul is compared to a candle. You know, lemashal, sometimes after a person passes away, what do we do for his honor, in his memory? What do? We light a candle. Not only that, but sometimes in the old synagogues, the old Ashkenaz synagogues, even some Sephardic synagogues, they have plaques of people that passed away. And next to the plaques, what do they have? A little light. So when the person's yortzeit comes along, when his Yom HaShanah is, when his anniversary of his death is, you turn on the light, because the light is reminiscent of the soul. In fact, says Sfat Emet, that a part of a person's soul is called nefesh. We know that a person has 5 parts of his soul, and the lowest part of his soul is called nefesh. Says Sfat Emet that nefesh is actually an acronym. It's actually Rosh Tevot. Nefesh is spelled, imagine how nefesh is spelled in your mind. Nun, Pei, and Shin. Says Sfat Emet, it actually stands for Ner, Petila, and Shemen. That means the Ner is the receptacle, the Petila is the wick, and the Shemen is the oil. Therefore, anytime you see nefesh is always a reference to the Ner, Petila, and the Shemen. How a neshama is lit. Based on the introduction, says Sfat Emet, now I understand the Gemara. When the Gemara says, Petilot ushmanim, these wicks and this oil, she'ein madlikim behem b'Shabbat. You see, he says Sfat Emet, that Shabbat has very high standards. Shabbat is a very holy day. Like Chaim said right before we started the class, Shabbat is a very holy day. And sometimes, in order to connect to Shabbat, a person has to have, his soul has to be holding at a certain place, at a certain spot. Because if the soul is not holding Chaim, then the soul won't connect to Shabbat. We have to understand, it's a zechut to keep Shabbat.
Which part of the soul?
His soul won't connect. Sometimes there are certain souls that don't connect to Shabbat. Why? Because they don't have that feeling yet. It's a zechut to keep Shabbat, Chaim. You have to be lucky to keep Shabbat. If you don't keep Shabbat, that means you don't have the zechut. You need a merit to serve God. And if you don't serve God, that means that you don't have the merit. The fact that we come along on a Thursday night and we come and listen to a class, or we pray every single morning, Shaharit and Hanavit, or we put on tefillin, or the fact that we're able to do mitzvot, don't take that lightly. That means that we have a certain zechut. It's either the zechut of our fathers, our forefathers, our great, whatever it is, we did something in our life that God said, this man deserves to serve me. If you do not serve God, that means you do not deserve it. If you have a servant, and the servant comes along and he says he could brag of the fact that he gets to serve the king, or you have a secret service agent that comes along and he brags to his friends at the bar that he is so lucky that he gets to protect the president. That's a zechut. That you have bragging rights, the fact that you could say that you're so close to the king. It's a zechut to serve God, it's a zechut to keep Shabbat. And some people, their souls are not holding there yet. And therefore you have some people amongst Am Yisrael, their souls, they could connect to Shabbat because they're lucky enough. However, there's certain souls that do not connect to Shabbat because their souls are not holding there yet. Shabbat is very high, but their souls are very low. Says Sfat Emet, that's what it means in this Gemara that says there's certain pitilot ushmanim. Don't read it the way I translated it as wicks and oil. Rather, look at wicks and oil as the soul. Therefore, says Sfat Emet, Pitilot ushmanim, those souls of those people, she'anu hachamim, that the rabbis tell us, she'ein madlikim behem b'Shabbat. They don't have the connection to Shabbat yet because they're not holding on the level where they can keep Shabbat. You understand? Their souls have not been yet jump-started where they have the ability to keep Shabbat. Like I said again, Abutai, you need a tremendous zechut to keep it. You know, sometimes on Monday night, we speak about Shabbat a lot. And Rabbi Sutton has a book called Living Shabbat. He has a great story over there with Baron Rothschild. You know what that was, Jeff? Baron Rothschild, very, very wealthy banker a couple of hundred years ago. And he was one of the biggest leading bankers in Europe, but at the same time, he was a deeply religious man. Deeply religious. And he made a big deal about keeping Shabbat because he tried to influence other people. The fact that he kept Shabbat, he tried to, do the same for other people to, kind of influence and represent what the Shabbat stands for. He says one time, there was a certain company in Europe that was about to go bankrupt. So they figured that they needed saving. They needed somebody with a lot of money to bail them out. So the manager of this company, he said to himself, Baron Rothschild is the man to help me out. So Erev Shabbat, Friday, once Shabbat came in, he sent a telegram to Mr. Rothschild and he says, listen, my business, it needs bailing out. I'm willing to sell it to you very cheap. He sent him the price of 2.5 million pounds sterling. That was the price that this man sent to Mr. Baron Rothschild. The only thing is that it was already Shabbat. And Mr. Rothschild doesn't check his telegram. But the manager of this company didn't know that it's Shabbat, didn't know that Mr. Rothschild kept Shabbat. So he figured the reason why he's not answering him is because the price was too high. So the very next day, he sends him another telegram. Forget about the 2.5 pounds sterling. How about 2.2 million pounds sterling? But again, it's Shabbat. And Mr. Rothschild is not checking his telegrams. And the guy thought again, the reason why he's ignoring me is because it must be that the price is too high. So finally, Sudash Lishi time, right before Shabbat ended, he sends him 1.7. This is a true story. The lowest price he could have bought it for. The moment Shabbat ended, Mr. Rothschild opens his telegrams and he sees, at the end of the day, who was the negotiator for Mr. Rothschild? God was. It went from 2.5 to 2.2 to 1.7. At the end of the day, he bought the company. But he publicized this story in order to show people how incredible it is that when a person keeps the Shabbat is really keeping him. So again, even for religious people, it's very hard sometimes to connect the Shabbat. Even amongst us, you can have a lot of people that come along, and even as it gets closer to the end of Shabbat, they want to know, what time does Shabbat finish? Is it 5:15? Is it 5:17? Is there 3 stars outside? They have a hard time, even by Sudash Lishit, which is known as the holiest time. People don't know it that, by the way. They don't know that fact. They think that Sudash Lishit already, as Shabbat is coming out, maybe that's the least important time. It's the opposite. That's why it's also the hardest for people to stay in shul, Sudash Lishit. They'd rather just go home and have a 2-minute, quick bread. They come back for Arvit. It's not true. If you could stay in shul for Sudash Lishit and hear the drasha, that is the holiest time. Zohar says it's called Rabbi Avin. The holiest time of Shabbat is Sudash Lishit. But yet the Satan, he works very hard to try to distract you, that he makes you leave shul just so you don't get that holiness. So again, even for religious people, it's hard to connect. Because the Shabbat is held on a very high level for Hashem. That's why he says, She'ein madlikim behem b'Shabbat, because some people, they have a hard time connecting. He tells another story, Rabbi Satan. He says, one time there was an abrech in the kollel. Couldn't afford a lot. He wasn't wealthy at all. He was in minus. He was in minuses. And he says that on Shabbat one day, Chaim, listening to the story, his son got sick. This abrech, his son got sick. And he got nervous. He knew that he had a doctor that living on his block that was non-religious. He decided to take him to the doctor. He said, listen, I need you to help my son. He's really not feeling well. The doctor said, no problem, but you have to pay me 500 shekel for my visit. He said, okay, I'll give it to you after Shabbat. He goes, no, I want it on Shabbat. He goes, what's the big deal? I'll give you after Shabbat. He goes, no. He goes, I know you religious people. You like to swindle. If you don't pay me the 500 shekel now, I'm not seeing your son. Okay, listen. Pikuach nefesh. The boy is sick. The avrech said, no problem. Do you take a check? He goes, I take a check. So the doctor comes over to the avrech's house. He looks around Bemet. He can see that he can't afford anything, but that's his price. After he examines the son, he tells him what to do. The avrech says, okay, let me pay you now. He takes out his checkbook. It's Shabbat. You have to break Shabbat for Pikuach Nefesh for the sake of health. So he writes a check out for 1,000 shekel, which is 1,000. And the doctor said, I don't know if you heard me, but I said 500. I said 500 shekel. The Avrech says, I know, but if I have to write 500 shekel in Hebrew, the way you say it is 500 shekel. It's 3 words. However, if I say 1,000 shekel, 1,000 shekel, that's only 2 words. 1,000 shekel. Therefore, he said, I'm willing to spend the extra 500 shekel just to break Shabbat a little less. The doctor was so impressed. He took the check, he showed it to his wife. He goes, this avrech was willing to pay me double just to be mechalel Shabbat a little less. And I looked around his apartment, he told his wife, and I saw he didn't have anything, but yet he's willing to double the paycheck just so not to break Shabbat a little less. He was so impressed with this story. The doctor from that story became about teshuvah. It's an incredible story, but yet you see sometimes that you need a zechut to connect to Shabbat. If you don't have the zechut, you're not going to connect because the Shabbat is held on a very, very high level. However, says Sfat Emet. Sfat Emet. Unbelievable. He says that could apply to Shabbat, where sometimes it's very difficult for people to connect. However, says Sfat Emet, there is one time a year. There is one time a year that even though you have certain souls that cannot connect to the Shabbat, But there's one time a year that even the lowest souls, even the most downtrodden, even the most lost, they can connect to a holiday. Which holiday is that, Rabotai? Hit it on the nail. It's Chanukah. That's what the continuation of the Gemara says. Amar Rav, Pitilot Ushmanim, those souls, Sha'amru Hachamim, that the rabbis tell us, She'ein Madlikim Behem B'Shabbat, they cannot connect to the Shabbat, however, Madlikim Behem Chanukah. On Chanukah, they can connect. Their souls, even though it's low, and even though it's in a bad place, for some reason, says Sfat Emet, Chanukah has the ability to connect those lost souls to God Almighty. And he says how? Why is that true? Why is that true? Why is Chanukah so special? He says again, because on Shabbat, because Shabbat is high, you have to make preparations for Shabbat. You can't just come along and say, the moment Shabbat comes in, you quickly came home from work, you took a shower, maybe you didn't take a shower because Shabbat comes in at 4 o'clock, you show up to shul, you say, okay, I'm here. Let's bring in the Shabbat. It doesn't work that way. There has to be a preparation for the Shabbat. The rabbis talk about this in depth. They say not only does the person have to make what's called a physical preparation, he has to actually help out his house. That's what there's a whole siman, whole seif in Shulchan Aruch that talks about what everybody has to do in order to prepare for Shabbat. We've been talking about it. Either you have to light the candles for your wife or prepare the candles for your wife. You have to do something with the food. You have to set the table. You have to vacuum the house. Do something in preparation for Shabbat. But not only that, there also has to be what's called a mental preparation. Some great tzaddikim, some great rabbis, they're already preparing for Shabbat in their minds on Wednesday. They say to themselves, on Wednesday, that's the correct time according to the Harizal, when a person should be mentally preparing himself for Shabbat Kodesh. On Wednesday, he should say, there's only 2 days left until Shabbat. Thursday, only 1 day left. Friday, it's Shabbat tonight. Very excited. You have to mentally prepare yourself for Shabbat because the Shabbat is so great. We come along on Friday night and we say, Boi Kala. I hereby welcome the Kala because there's a preparation for the Kala. However, it says Sfat Emet on Chanukah, that's not true. On Chanukah, God comes along and he comes to us, which is an amazing concept. Because on Shabbat, we go to the Shekhinah, we go to God's presence. But on Chanukah, it's such a holy holiday that God comes along and he says that no matter how low you've gotten, the Shekhinah comes all the way down to you. And it's a tremendous hidush. Why am I saying that? Because Sfat Emet says, and he explains unbelievable. He says, generally speaking, we have a rule. The rule is that Shekhinah, God's presence, never lowers itself below 10 tefachim. How much is 10 tefachim, gentlemen, for argument's sake? It's about 32 inches. So God's presence, no matter where it's found, it's never lower than 32 inches from the ground. Why? That's where it's not considered kabod. From 32 inches, that's already considered the ground, therefore God won't lower himself. However, on Chanukah, he goes even lower than that. Again, to pick up the souls that are considered lost. And what's the proof to that, Rabotai? Chaim, let me ask you a question. A person asks you, halakha, where do I have to position my Chanukiah in my house? What do you answer him?
By the window.
By the window, yes, it's true, indeed. That's the mihag today, which is what my son answered me when I asked him that in the car. But halakha says that right now, before we go to outside, position-wise, height-wise, not above, below 10 tefachim, dafka. Halakha writes between 3 tefachim, which is 10 inches, and 10 tefachim, which is 32 inches, that is the sweet spot. We are putting the Chanukah, the menorah dafka, lower than 10 tefachim, because we're trying to show that on Chanukah, that's where God is. That's where God is. God is lower than 10 tefachim on Chanukah in order to tell us that even though it's not kavod for the Shekhinah to be in this spot, but on Chanukah time, God lowers himself kiviyachol in order to pick up those downtrodden nishamot that they feel that they're lost. God says, I'm willing to lower myself even lower than 10 tefachim in order to rise them up, in order to bring them up. And again, we can continue. Someone mentioned over here that you let them in all where? Outside. Again, outside, not only is it outside is also dafka at night. Not only is that at night, it's also on the left side. All these things, it's all symbolic, Rabotai. Outside represents the tum'ah. Greatest darkness is when it's dark outside, that's where the tum'ah lurks. That's where it's the biggest concentration or manifestation of darkness, of sitra hara, of whatever you want to call it. It's dafka at nighttime. Not only at nighttime, but it's also on the left side of the door. What's the left side, Rabotai? The left side always, in the realm of Kabbalah, the left side is always what's called Giburah. It's always a deen. It's always judgment. Not only that, but how do you say left in Hebrew? Small. Hazaku Baruch. How do you spell small? Sin, mem, aleph, lamed. In Hebrew, the sin and the samach, they're interchangeable. kind of like hey and hit. It's also interchangeable. Therefore, if I switch out the scene of Simol, Wasamach, what does it spell, Chaim? Hazaku Baruch. So therefore, that means that anytime you see the left side always represents Satan. It always represents darkness. It always represents difficulty and Yetzer Hara. Therefore, we come along and we take the menorah and we light it specifically in those places which seems unbefitting. Dafka lower than Tetavahim. Dafka at night. Dafka on the left side. And all these things are symbolic in order to tell somebody that this is where you could find God on Chanukah. Lehavdil. Imagine, it wouldn't be appropriate if you saw a big rabbi, a Gadol Hador, all of a sudden in the club. It's in a movie theater. You're not going to see. Bezat Hashem. We're going to tell a story about Rabbi Grossman later today. Because I cannot go and saying club and rabbi without saying Rabbi Grossman. But bottom line is that it's inappropriate to find a big rabbi in a place of Tumah. But Hanukkah is one of those exceptions. One of those times where even though you cannot light the Petil and the Shemen, for those people that cannot connect to Shabbat, however, to Hanukkah, they could connect. And all this is symbolic to say that no matter how low a person has sunk, and no matter how many sins he has done, and no matter if he comes along and he says that he has lost confidence in himself, and even God doesn't love me, God says, on Chanukah, I come along and I scoop you up from the bottom and I say, it's okay, I'm here for you. Because that's exactly what Greek ideology wants us to believe, that we're lost. That we're lost, and no matter what we do, we cannot ever pick ourselves up. It's a holiday. Chanukah is a holiday that everybody could connect to. Everybody, no matter how low you are, you could connect to Chanukah. God rescues everybody on Chanukah. And a person should never ever let his past dictate his future. It's an unbelievable line that I just said and has tremendous ramification. But again, you should hang this up somewhere. A person should never allow his past to dictate his future. Because and this is a huge concept in psychology also, that it's unfortunate that people have a lot what's called baggage, and they have what's called demons in the closet. Their past, it sort of paralyzes them or it stuns them from doing anything productive in the future because they're always saying to themselves, how could I do anything great? Look what I have done in the past. And since our rabbis, that is Greek ideology. They want to come along and they want to stunt your growth by saying that you've been so bad in the past, there's no reason for you to do anything in the future. That is what's called baggage. That's what's called demons in the closet. That's what you allowing your past to dictate your future. Think about it, Abutai. One of the things that the Greeks made us do, and the rabbis make a big deal about this. One of the decrees was that anytime that you would plow your field using a cow, the Greeks made you tattoo on the horn of the cow, Keren Hashor. They made you say, Ein lanu chelek belokei Yisrael. That's what the Jewish people had to see over and over again as they used their own cows to plow their field. A decree from the Greeks was, you must tattoo on the horns of your cow. It was, the Gemara says this, the Midrash talks about it, they have to write on the horns, Ein lanu chelek belokei Yisrael. We have no portion in God Almighty. And every time the Jew plowed his field, he would look at it and it would drill, it would burn a hole into his soul because he would just say to himself over and over again, this is what the Greeks want. This is what they want me to believe, that I am not good enough to have a connection with God. And why dafka, by the way, everything is symbolic. Why did they make you do it in the horns of a cow, of a calf? Anybody want to know why? Take a guess. Why dafka on a cow? Hazaku Baruch Isaac, only when paying attention, because they try to say that just like you did the egel, you can never recover from the egel. Dafka, they want you to print that Ein lanu chelek belokei Yisrael in the shore, which is the cow, which is the ox, in order to remind us day in and day out, this is the sin that we did, and therefore it's from this sin that we can never recover. It's an unbelievable concept. This is what they want you to think. This is what they want you to remember, that a person can never grow from this. And that's when Hashem comes along, and that's when Hashem says, on Chanukah, that's a big no. Do not believe in the Greek methodology. Do not believe in the Greek ideology to come along and say that your past will dictate your future, even though you have done wrong. And even though you have committed sin, even though you have stooped so low, God come along and God says, even though it's a place that's not befitting for me, God says, I don't belong lower than 10 tefachim, but if it's in order to recover the Jewish soul, I will do it. Rabbi, a lot of rabbis, they say, Chanukah is such a holy day, a holy time. The culmination of the high holidays, according to some, happens when? On Chanukah. That means that whatever we started with in Elul, with the 40 days and the Slichot and whatever it was, that it climaxed on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the 10 days of repentance. For most people, when the holidays end, for most people. No, Simchat Torah, that's what ended for me. That's what ended for me, that's what it's supposed to end. But for some rabbis, they come along and they said that Chanukah is the end. So therefore, that means that on Rosh Hashanah, we say HaMelech Lasadeh. That means the king is in the field and he's accessible. But on Chanukah, according to Sfat Emet at least, God says, not only am I in the field, not only am I next to you in your home, but I go so low to pick up those lost Jewish souls. That even though a person can be found in the dumps, in the dirt, God says, I am there to save him. And that's what the translation of that piece in the Gemara that says that there's certain petilot shemanim, there's certain wicks and oil in reference to the Jewish soul that the rabbis will tell you that do not connect to Shabbat, that cannot light their soul on Shabbat because their soul is not there yet. However, on Chanukah, dafka, because their soul is low, God says that's where I am found and that's when I lift everybody up. Rabbi, the question is, obviously this is a parasha class, so we have to connect it somehow to Parashat HaShavua. Okay, Chaim? He says, we know the concept that's called Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim. We haven't mentioned yet in the parasha series. What is Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim? If I had to oversimplify it, what does that mean? That means, in English, it's called a precursor. You know what a precursor is? That anything that happened to the Avot HaKadoshim, anything that happened to the forefathers, and by the way, according to Zohar HaKadosh, Yosef is in this general rule. Even though Yosef is not considered a forefather, but he's in the rule of Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim. So for anything that happened to the forefathers, it was a precursor. They lived out history first, and then whatever they acted, however they acted, and however they behaved in certain situations, that is the way we have to act in something that's similar that happens to us. Can I give you a mashal? Let's say, sometimes you have football, and in football you have what's called a game plan. A game plan is a book of strategies that the coach will have in order to say, well, if this happens, we're going to do this. If that happens, we're going to do that. Sometimes the coaches and even the players, they watch very old videos of football games in order to know, in certain situations, how do you act. That's called a game plan. Lahavdil, whatever life and whatever activities the Avot did in their lifetime, the Bible is not a storybook. It's not just Bible stories. It's a lesson on how the Jewish people are supposed to behave in our lives based on the way the Avot behaved. So therefore, anytime you see a story, anytime you see history, and you want to know where in history did this happen to our forefathers, you can most probably find it. And the question is, how do we find this pishat in the Sfat Emet? That he comes along and he says that Chanukah is such a beautiful holiday. That God comes along and God says, I'm going to save you even though you're in the lowest point in your life. God says on Chanukah, I'm going to be there. Where do we find that Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim? That God says, if you're there and if you're low, I will pick you up. I think the answer is this week's parasha. And let's review. Yosef, 17 years old. Sold down the river by his brothers because of jealousy. However you want to interpret that, not the jealousy that we know, but there was a trace of jealousy in the brothers' hearts. And they come along and they said that if you were to look, if there was a video camera about the brothers judging Yosef, you wouldn't have seen a bunch of guys that were jealous of their brother. They hated their brother. You would have seen rabbis in long coats and beards and peyot behind their ears with books judging a capital punishment case. And these brothers, they came to the logical and the intellectual conclusion that Yosef either has to die or has to be sold. And they sell Yosef to the Egyptians. Ishmaelim to the Egyptians. And he ends up in the house of what's called Potiphar. And now you have the wife of Potiphar, the famous Eshet, Hazaku Baruch Zuleha. Very good. And day in and day out, we know that she was seducing Yosef. Tried to get Yosef to somehow subjugate himself to her. And every single day the Midrash says she was changing clothes, and she was acting all nice, and she would put on different perfume and different makeup, all trying to get Yosef to fall in love with her. And we know that Yosef, again, there is no recourse over here. There are no witnesses. This is not like you're in a neighborhood where people know who you are. No Jews. It's just me and her in a town that nobody knows my name. Maybe it's not a bad idea. And day in, day out, she's seducing. And Yosef finally, the Torah tells us that he came to that day by he. Kehayom hazeh, the switch parasha. Vayavo Yosef la'asot melachto. He came to do his work. He came to do his work. And all of a sudden, the Torah tells us that she came along and she said it straight to his face. Shichva imi, be with me. And we know the story. Yosef, he leaves his shirt in his hands. He saw what's called diokno shel aviv. He saw the image of his father in the window, and he leaves and he doesn't commit the sin. Rabbi, what was so special about that day? It was on that day that this malacha was supposed to be done, but Yosef, somehow he was saved by diokno shel aviv, and he ran away. What was so special about this day that Yosef was saved? Like we know that she tells us, this wasn't just an ordinary day. It was actually what's called Yom Edam. What's Yom Edam? Their holiday. It was their holiday, however you want to call it, but Yom Edam, where nobody was found in their homes. It was a time that everybody was in their Beit Avodah Zarah, in their churches, in their mosques, and they were all worshiping their God, and nobody was in the house. And this Eshet Potiphar, she used that as an opportunity to come along and say, this is the day that I'm going to finally beat Yosef. Now, imagine right now, Rabotai, you have everything working against Yosef. You have Mitzrayim, which is considered the hotbed of Tum'ah. No worse place in the world except Egypt. The amount of avodah zarah, the amount of idolatry, the amount of promiscuity, the amount of decadence and low lives that was the world was Egypt. So you have Mitzrayim, hotbed of Tumah. You have Yom Edam. You have their holiday, which again, in their holiday, which is one of the books talk about this, that on the day of the holidays of the Goyim, a lot of Tumah in the world, Chaim. You hear what I'm saying? The day of the holidays of the Goy, a lot of Tumah. That's why you're going to find some Hasidim, they don't learn Torah on December 25th. For them, it's a sort to learn Torah that day. Why? Because any Torah that you learn on their holiday, since there's so much Tumah in the world, the Tumah latches onto the Kedusha. So therefore, on December 25th, some people, the Minhag, they don't learn any Torah. Some people have the Minhag not to learn Torah the whole year round. But these guys, they don't learn Torah on the 25th Dafka. We learn Torah. Our Minhag is to learn, because we say the Kedusha fights the Tumah. But bottom line is that you have a tremendous kohot working against Yosef. You have Mitzrayim, all Tumah. You have Yom Edam, their holiday. Everything is stacking against Yosef, but yet somehow he sold what's called Diokno Shel Aviv. Rabotai, give me a peshat. You talk to me. What does it mean, Diokno Shel Aviv? Was Yosef hallucinating? Zohar, was Yosef hallucinating? No. You ever see your father's image in the window? No. So what does that mean? He saw Diokno Shel Aviv. He saw his father's image in the window. Which father are we talking about, Rabotai? That's the simple peshat. He saw his dad's image. But what if I were to tell you that sometimes we refer to God as our Father, as we say it in the high holidays, Avinu Malkeinu. So the Diokno Shel Aviv that we're talking about wasn't the image of Yaakov. It was Diokno Shel Aviv, Shel Avinu Malkeinu, Shel Melech HaOlam. He saw God's image in the window. God's presence came to him on that day and said, Yosef, you're finding yourself in the lowest of the low situation. You're in Mitzrayim, Yom Edam. You're about to sin with the wife of Potiphar. There is no lower than Yosef right now. But God says, even though you're so low right now, guess what day it was, Rabotai? This is a well-known fact. Maybe I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. But the rabbis tell us that day that Yosef was in the house of Eshet Potiphar, and he had full intent, full kavanah to sin with her on that day was Chanukah. And how do I know? We have no calendar. How do we know? What's the famous Rambam, gentlemen? Vehi kehayom hazeh. That's what Torah says. It was on that day. Vehi kehayom hazeh. Says the rabbis, take the word kehayom hazeh, kehayom, chaf hey, kehayom, chaf hey, yom. Mazeh chaf hey yom? 25th day of what? 25th day of Kislev. It was on that day, which is Chanukah, the 25th day of Kislev, that God came along and God said exactly the Hidush of the Sfat Emet, that God says no matter how low you are, those Shemanim and Pitilot, those candles, those wicks and those oil, that neshama that does not have a connection to Shabbat, madliki behem b'Hanukah. You could definitely light their candle on Hanukah because God says, I am there with you. I am there in the lowest part on the downtrodden souls. On that day, Chav Hey Yom, 25th day of Kislev, God says, I come to you and I save you from the worst of Tumah. By the way, this makes a lot of sense. Chaim, what do you do after you light the candles on Hanukkah time?
Pray.
What else? But what else besides Mizmolah David? There's another Perek in Tehillim that we read. Yosef B'Seter. Ben Haggadah the Ben Ish Chai says you're supposed to read Yosef B'Seter 7 times. 7 times. Why do we read Yosef B'Seter, Rabotai? Does anybody know another Jewish ceremony that we say Yosef B'Seter over and over again? By the funerals. What's the connection between Yosef B'Seter by the Levaya and Yosef B'Seter by Hanukkah time? The answer is exactly like the Sfat Emet is telling you, that because where some people are found on Hanukkah, they're found in the lowest of the low, like Yosef, he's found in the Tum'ah Sheb'Tum'ah. Yosef B'Seter is there in order to ward off the bad spirits. That's why we read it by the funeral, because once by Minan there's a dead body, once there is a emptiness or a void of Kedusha, the moment there's a void of Kedusha, the Tum'ah loves to cling on it. And therefore, once you have a body that once hosted a neshama, now that the neshama has left the body, there is now a vacuum. It creates a vacuum that it leaves the body. Now there's a void of kedusha. The moment you have a void of kedusha, the tumah loves to latch on, and therefore, in order to protect the body from the tumah that loves to latch, we say the words. We read that mizmor and Tehillim in order to ward off the tumah. Therefore, the rabbis tell us that just like you read Yosef B'Seter in order to ward off the tumah and the kalipa and all the negative energy by the dead body, we do the same thing with Hanukkah. Because Hanukkah on that time, lower than Tetvachim, Dafka outside, Dafka on the left side, which is Samich Mem, Gibura Din, whatever you want to call it, we read Yosef B'Seter in order to ward off all the tumah, all the negativity, all the bad vibes, as they call it, Chaim. In order to get rid of those things, Yosef B'Seter is a very, very, very key type of mizmor, and everything is connected. Based on this, Rabotai, Chanukah is the perfect time not only to reawaken our souls, but also the souls of everybody around us that's in not the best of situations. What better time to involve ourselves in what's called outreach, in what's called kiruv? Again, if the Sfat Emet is telling me that in the lowest of the low places, that's where God is found, and God is there in order to rescue those lost souls, why can't we be like God? Mahu afata. Whatever God is doing, we should do so as well. So therefore, if God is involving himself in what's called kiruv, in what's called outreach, at the best time to do outreach, which is Chanukah, which is even though you're low, God says, I will save you. And God says, I will be there. Why can't we meet God there? Why can't we come along and say, Hashem, whatever you're doing now, outreach on Chanukah, which is arguably the best time to do outreach, because that's when you could touch those souls that are lost. Madliki behem b'Chanukah. Why can't we say, God, I'm going to meet you there as well? There's a chidush I wasn't planning on saying, and I said this here in the past. Actually, I believe I was right here, Shulash Rashid, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. We said a fantastic chidush from the Magadei Amukot. He says over there, he says, there was once a famous tzaddik, and his name was Hanoch. Anybody know who Hanoch was? Chaim, you know who that is? Hanoch? Hanoch was one of the grandchildren of Adam Rishon. And he has a very short what's called screen time in Parashat Bereshit, right before Parashat Noach. How the Torah is listing a bunch of generations of people. And it says that a man was born by the name of Hanoch, and Hanoch was also Hitalech im Elokim. He was a man that walked with God. And all of a sudden the Torah says, Ve'enenu, and he became no more. Why? Ki lakach oto Hashem, because God took him. There's a famous debate amongst the rabbis. What is more proper? Is it more proper to focus on a person's own avodat Hashem, on your own Judaism? Are you supposed to focus on your own Judaism? Or after you've done certain internal work, are you supposed to go ahead and help other people that have not realized what you have realized? Are you supposed to help them? Are you supposed to do what's called, again, outreach? self-kiruv. You're supposed to help other people realize the truth that you have realized. The Torah says, well, from this proof of Hanoch was a man that was hitalech im Elokim. He was a guy that said, my relationship with God is more important than anything else. And therefore, I don't care if my neighbor is not observant. I don't care if my coworker is not observant. I don't care if my friend is not religious. As long as I'm okay, that's more than enough. God says, I don't need a Hanoch in the world. Because if you're not going to help other people reach the conclusions that you have done, therefore, there is no point of you living. Therefore, Torah tells us, Hanoch was a very religious man, very righteous. Hitalech im Elokim. But at the end of the day, ve'enenu. But he was gone because God took him, because God said, I don't need you here if you don't help my children. Magellan Makot says that this man called Hanoch, he was mitgalgel. What does that mean? He came back as a reincarnated soul into Yosef HaTzadik. Yosef HaTzadik was the Gilgul of Hanoch. Why is this Magalei Makot? Because Yosef's job, one of the reasons why he went down to Egypt was to pave a path for Am Yisrael when we eventually get down there, to set up a Jewish environment for Am Yisrael. He was Osek, was called Kiruv Rechokim. That's why it says, if you pay attention, in this week's parasha, it says that Yosef was very good friends with the Shvatim of Bnei Bilha and Bnei Zilpah. And look at Rashi on the spot. Rashi says that he was what's called a Na'ar. Yosef is always referred to as a Na'ar. Yosef, he's a Na'ar with Bnei Bilha and Bnei Zilpah. Rashi says, what does that mean that he was a Na'ar? He was a child. How do you define child? Rashi says, because he used to do what's called Maaseh Na'arut. You know what that means? He used to do things that kids do. They used to twirl their hair. He used to look inside the mirror. And I'm thinking to myself, Rashi, are you serious? Is that Yosef HaTzadik? The man that has the suffix of the word tzaddik, not everybody gets to have that last name of HaTzadik. That means you're a very righteous man. That means you're a holy man. And yet, Rashi's telling me that he was what's called misasil b'sa'aro. He was making his hair nice. What does Yosef care about his looks? What does Yosef care about his looks? Do you think the rabbis care about their looks? You think Chacham Ovadia looked inside the mirror? You think Rabbi Steinemann looked inside the mirror? They don't care about the way they look. If the rabbis of our generation didn't care about the way they looked, you think Yosef was looking inside the mirror? He was misasel b'sa'aro. He cared all of a sudden about his hair. What's pishat, Rabotai? Connecting. Hazaku Baruch Jeff. Because sometimes when a person needs to connect with somebody else that doesn't look like him, he can't come along and approach somebody that's not affiliated with a long beard and a top hat and a long jacket with tzitzit hanging out. That guy, he's going to be scared of you. He's going to say, automatically, he's going to paint a picture on your forehead. This guy, do not come close to. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when a person is involved in an outreach, he has to look like just everybody else. He has to look like your regular Joe Schmo. Look like the guy, I'm just like you. I could be just like you. I look like you. I could talk like you, maybe a little more refined, but I can still have a connection to God. Therefore says Yosef HaTzadik, the reason why he was misasel b'sa'aro, he's making his hair nice, because he said, I cannot look like the rabbi and still change that guy's life. I have to look like him. I have to make myself fancy. I have to make myself presentable in order to do kiruv in the right way. That's why it says Magalei Makot. It's no coincidence. Again, what did we just say Yosef is called? He's called the Na'ar. He's called the child. What is the famous pasuk that we always say when it comes to chinuch of your children? What do we say? Hanoch le'na'ar al pi darko. Says Magalei Makot. You think it's a coincidence that those two words were chosen? Again, Yosef is the Na'ar. Hanoch he turned into Yosef. Therefore, when it says Hanoch le'na'ar al pi darko, that means that Hanoch is the Na'ar. Hanoch is Yosef HaTzadik. In order to tell us that our job and our mission in this world, just like God comes along on Chanukah and he says, I'm willing to go to the depths, I'm willing to go to the lowest of the low in a place that's not befitting for me. But at the same time, if it means saving a Jewish soul, I will be there. I will be there. And if he's there, if God is there, why are we not doing the same thing? Why are we not going the step further? Rabbi, maybe it's not the place, but a few months ago, I stopped being the director of NCSY, which is a kiruv organization. I quit a few months ago. And I quit with the full intent of starting our own organization. Our own meaning for us. What does it mean for us? For the Sfaradim. For the Sephardic for the Sephardic tradition. Why, Rabotai? Why is that so important? Why is that so important? I'm not trying to make now taharut. I'm not trying to make any competition. I'm not trying to do that. But at the same time, we need our own things. We have to stop acting like we are second-class citizens to everybody else. I'll never forget that I had a meeting with Rabbi Chaimov a few months ago, and we were talking about opening up our own situation, whatever it is, our own school, our own organizations. Rabbi Chaimov told me that he was sending his kids to Ashkenaz schools in Queens, and he said that one day the principal called him inside the office, and he told him, he was Rabbi Chaimov, when are you going to stop being second-class citizens? When are you going to do something on your own? When are we going to have our own things, our own organizations, our own... Shuls are great, but shuls are not doing the best job. There always has to be something else. Why are we settling? Why are we okay with the fact that we don't have our own things? Why isn't there a Sephardic outreach center in the 5 towns? Why isn't there not a Sephardic school in the 5 towns? You have to start somewhere. And therefore, with a couple of good people from the community, we came along and we started the first Sephardic outreach organization. We're calling it a B'nai Or, the children of light. And there's no coincidence that Dafka on Chanukah, that's when we're starting. The Or, the light of Chanukah, like we said before from Sfat Emet, there's no coincidence of why it's called B'nai Or. It's because Dafka, those nishamot, they cannot reach on Shabbat, they cannot have that light on Shabbat, but they're guaranteed that on Chanukah, everybody has a connection to. God says Chanukah is the holiday for everybody. And even though you are so low, like Yosef, and even though you are in the hotbed of Tumah like Mitzrayim, and it's Yom Edam, but you see the Yokno Shel Aviv, you see God's image in the window, you see God's Shekhinah, He says, I am there to help. And God says that Chanukah is the best time to connect with everybody. I'm going to end with one last story because I promised you a story from Rabbi Grossman. Rabbi Grossman has a story. If anybody who doesn't know who Rabbi Grossman is, he is the chief rabbi of Migdal Emek, still currently. And they say about him that it was 1979, and he was visiting. Morty, you listening to the story? 1979, Rabbi Grossman is visiting Golders Green in London, and he says that he's walking on Golders Green Road, and he sees a group of Israelis talking Hebrew as they pass by him. And for an Israeli to see Israelis outside of Israel, you get a little excited. There's something about hearing people speak Hebrew, not in the streets of Israel. You get excited a little bit. So he turned around, he says, Atem Yisraelim? Are you guys Israeli? Now you have to know about something about Rabbi Grossman. He was kind of famous. He was kind of a movie star because the Israeli agency, they published a documentary about him. He was known as the disco rabbi because again, his thing was going inside the discos and rescuing people. Therefore, he was pretty famous and everybody knew who Rabbi Grossman was. So as he's passing by this group of Israelis and he asked them, Atem Yisraelim? They recognized him right away. They said, aren't you the disco rabbi? And he said, indeed I am. So one of the guys says, Rabbi, I have a question for you. He says, he goes, I'm dating a non-Jewish girl, says this man. And he goes, and I want to marry her, but my parents are not letting me marry her unless they convert. Rabbi, could you help me convert this girl? So Rabbi Grossman looks at him, he says, I am shocked that you have the audacity, that you have no shame to tell me that you're dating a Jewish girl, a non-Jewish girl, and you have no remorse about it. You expect me to kiss you on your forehead because you are dating a non-Jewish girl? And this boy, he got offended a little bit. And he said, well, Rabbi, it's not only me. There's a lot of Israelis in London that are dating non-Jewish girls. And he says, really? He goes, is there a place of this? He goes, yes. He goes, we have an Israeli club, a disco. And it's actually called, the club that's called HaNegev. And HaNegev is on a street called Finley Road in London. And that's where a lot of Israelis, that's where we go in the middle of the night to party. And a lot of these men over there, they are dating non-Jewish girls. Rabbi Grossman says, HaNegev. On Finley. Rabbi Grossman says, I'll be in touch. Later that night, he goes to his host home. He lights Chanukah because it's Chanukah. And he asks his host, he says, do you have an extra menorah for me? He goes, why? Because I want to go light it in the disco. And the host knows not to ask Rabbi Grossman any questions. He gives them a spare menorah, and Rabbi Grossman is out the door. Gets inside a taxi, goes all the way to this Hanegev on Finley Road. He walks inside, and you can imagine, Rabbi, long beard, top hat, fur coat, and there's strobe lights everywhere, and people are dancing loud music. Rabbi Grossman goes right up to the DJ, who was also Israeli, and he taps him on the shoulder. And at first, the Israeli DJ doesn't recognize him or doesn't realize that he's there because he's in the middle of a party. But all of a sudden, he notices that somebody's tapping him, and he looks on his right, and all of a sudden he sees a rabbi there, somebody that the last person he expect to be next to him is next to him. And Rabbi Grossman says, Efshah, can I have the mic for a second? The DJ was so shocked that he sees a rabbi that he didn't even hesitate. He gave over the mic to Rabbi Grossman. Rabbi Grossman lowers the music and he says, Rabotai, Chanukah Sameach. And everybody says, Chanukah Sameach. He goes, gentlemen, tonight is one of the nights of Chanukah. I want, B'shutchem, with your permission, I want to light Chanukiah here. Atem Muchanim? And everybody screams out, Anachnu Muchanim. Does anybody here know how to light Chanukiah, says Rabbi Grossman. Some guy raises his hand and goes, come over here. He tells everybody in the crowd, put your hands on your friend's head so you can answer Amen. Rabbi Grossman always wears 2 pairs of kippot. One for himself and one just in case somebody else will need it. So he takes off his hat, pulls off one kippah, puts it on this man, and he says, Bahabo, light the Chanukiah. The guy he had a hard time starting, Rabbi Grossman helped him start. And all of a sudden, in unison, this whole club, imagine Abutai, I don't know if you can imagine what is going on over here. 1979, in the club called Hanegev, that smells like cologne and bad breath and BO, body odor.
On Finley.
On Finley, Rabbi Grossman is lighting Chanukiah with a bunch of non-affiliated Israelis, and they begin singing Ma'os Tzur. And after Ma'os Tzur is finished, Rabbi Grossman says, I need to talk to the men in the crowd. Anybody who's curious, follow me to the next room. Rabbi Grossman goes down, and like a stampede of men, they all follow Rabbi Grossman inside the room. And Rabbi Grossman begins, and he says, Rabotai, he says, what are we doing here? How do I hear that our Jewish boys, you're dating non-Jewish girls? Could that be true? And all of a sudden, a man speaks up, a boy speaks up, and he says, Rabbi, I don't see the difference between Jewish girls and non-Jewish girls. They're all females, if you ask me. Rabbi Grossman says, what is your name? And where are you from? He goes, my name is Shimon. I'm from a place called Or Akiva. And he pulls out his wallet and he shows Rabbi Grossman a picture of his father. A father that had a beard and he had peot behind his ears and a big kippah. And Rabbi Grossman, when he saw that, he began to cry. And he says, how could it be that you have strayed so far? How could it be that your father looks like this and you're dating a non-Jewish girl halfway around the world where nowhere close to Israel? And he said, Rabotai, he goes, doesn't make sense. He goes, I expect this, and forgive me. He says, I expect this from Ashkenazim, he says. Ashkenazim, those who came from Germany and from Hungary and from Poland, who have assimilated a long time ago, he says. He goes, but you are Sfaradim, he says. You've come from Morocco, you've come from Syria, you've come from Uzbekistan. You do not know how much your parents sacrificed for you in order to keep the religion. You don't know. Ashkenazim, they start slichot a couple of days before Rosh Hashanah, says Rabbi Grossman, because you start a month before. And the moment Rabbi Grossman said the word slichot, all of a sudden he felt it would be important to start singing the songs of slichot. And there it was, in the middle of the club, Rabbi Grossman is singing, Adon HaSelichot. And he says, the story goes that all those boys that were dating non-Jewish girls, they were all of a sudden transported 10, 15 years into the past, where they remembered themselves sitting in synagogue next to their fathers, singing the slichot that we sing on Elul, those traditional tunes that you can never get out of your head. Once you're in shul, you know those tunes forever. And they all began singing Adon HaSelichot together. An unbelievable scene. Rabbi Grossman says in the book how he was looking around and he was saying to himself, wow, slichot on Chanukah. When else are you going to find it? He's saying to himself, I wonder what God is thinking at this moment. And all of a sudden, after the song ended, they made a shiur together, a spontaneous class. I could imagine that Rabbi Grossman lit candles around 5 o'clock if that's the time. That class in Hanegev Club didn't end until 3 o'clock in the morning. talking to these boys, so many questions, so much thirst. Like the Sfat Emet is saying, no matter how low you have gone, God is there on Chanukah in order to save you, in order to lift you up from that grime, from that mud. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Rabbi Grossman said that his muscles were hurting. He said he sweated through his clothing, he said. And he said, I'm calling a taxi, I'm going home. And 2 of the boys, they stopped and they said, Rabbi, we need to talk to you now. He said, I can't now, gentlemen, tomorrow, I can't even open my eyes, I'm seeing double. He goes, it's an emergency, we need to talk to you right now. So they come inside the car with him, they take him wherever he goes, and before they can even open their mouths, they started crying. Rabbi Grossman said, what's the matter? Is everything okay? They said, Rabbi, the moment we moved to London, he said, we began involving ourselves in criminal activity. We were part of the mafia in 1979, he says. Whatever you could imagine, the worst you could imagine we have done. And girls, and drugs, and stealing, and racketeering, and money laundering, we've done it all. But after tonight, he said, we can't go back. Please, Rabbi, help us that we cannot go back. Rabbi Grossman said, no problem. I have a flight to New York tomorrow to do fundraising, but I'll cancel my trip. Let's go, come back with me to Israel. I'll take you to my yeshiva. They said, no, we can't go back to Israel either. He goes, why not? Because whatever we're doing in London, we were doing in Israel. We were gangsters in Israel. And we don't know what's waiting for us on the other side. We can't go back to Israel either. Rabbi Grossman had a backup idea. He goes, a friend of mine opened up a yeshiva in Paris, for Israeli Balei Tshuva. He goes, instead of going to New York, instead of going to Israel, I'm going to book a ticket with you. I'm going to go with you to Paris. He takes these 2 boys with him. He enrolls them in this yeshiva, and they became full-fledged Balei Tshuva. It's an unbelievable story. That's the way this chapter ends. The chapter that's called Slichot on Chanukah. It's a beautiful chapter. But at the same time, the lesson of Sfat Emet, it rings so true. And again, the lesson is that, I'll repeat the sentence one more time. Amar Rav, Pitilotu Shmanim Sha'anu Chachamim. Those wicks and those oils that the rabbis tell us you cannot light them on Chanukah, on Shabbat. She'ein madlikim behem b'Shabbat. Those souls that are not connected to Shabbat because they're not zocher. Madlikim behem b'Chanukah. But Chanukah, you can light them because God says, where I am so low because I'm going to pick them up lower than Tentavachim, outside on the left. God says, betoch tumato, in the tumah itself, I'm there to save them. God is there to save. What is stopping us to save them as well? Shabbat shalom u'mburach. Rabbi Hanina Bakashum at Zagud Shvot Zagot is Lafiga Hebelam to Onat Shneimar. Adon Haves the Man Tzidko Yagdil to Rabbi Yadir Yichtadah